Within the diets God created were the essential dietary fats. So what are omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids? These are fatty acids that our bodies require, yet we do not synthesize those. Therefore, we have to obtain these polyunsaturated fatty acids from our food, and that is the only place that we get them. Let's look at the natural meats from creation, and let's look at the essential fatty acid ratios of omega-6 and omega-3. Bison, which naturally grazed, 2.18 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Mule deer, naturally ranging in the mountains, 1.89 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Wild elk, 2.49 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Pheasant, 2.9 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. Wild hare is the same. Roe deer on the European continent, 2.5 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. Red deer, again European, 1.8 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. And beef, which naturally grazed, 1.34 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. These are balances of essential fatty acids that came to us as a result of God's work in creation. And these were the foods that were very good for the sustaining of other life forms, particularly mankind. Today's industrial agriculture's producing meat is very, very different than what we were given in creation. Rather than grazing on the green herbs of the field and grasses, our livestock today is fed grain and corn. So you take beef that is fed heavily on corn, the omega-6 ratio can be as high as nearly 27 to 1 omega-3. Chickens raised on corn and grain in confined animal feeding operations are approximately 16 to 1. Pork, which is primarily fed corn, can approach almost 30 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. And even grain-fed bison will test at 21 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Look at the striking difference between the omega-6 and 3 essential fatty acids found in the natural diets of animals and wildlife versus what happens when animals or livestock are fed grain-based, high seed oil diets. Anything near or less than 2.5 omega-6s to 1 omega-3 is a very healthy range, and it does not increase or promote disease in any way. When you increase the omega-6 fatty acids, which increases the excess oxidation and inflammation in our cells, you increase the degenerative disease rate substantially. Bison, mule deer, wild elk, pheasants, rabbit, red deer, roe deer, antelope, moose, even beef, all land in a very, very healthy range on natural forages. However, livestock, cattle, chickens, poultry, pork, even bison, when they are put into feedlot situations and have a high grain seed oil based diet, this escalates the omega-6s to a very unhealthy oxidative and inflammatory levels. As long as mankind consumed meat that was grazed on grasses and natural forages, we virtually had no degenerative disease. When we began confining animals and feeding them high grain diets with seed oils, we began to escalate the omega-6s in the balance of the meat. You can see the dramatic increase from the healthy ratios of approximately 2.5 to 1 or less up to the 15 and 20 and 30 to 1 ratios of omega-6 to omega-3 in the oil seed grains that are fed to livestock. Even worse than feeding grains to livestock is when these various grains are taken and the seed oils are extracted from those grains and put into our processed foods. Now consider palm oil at over 40 to 1 omega-6s to omega-3s. Refined corn oil now exceeds 80 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. In the corn seed, it generally ranges from 25 to 35 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. However, when you refine it into oil, that omega-6 concentration dramatically increases. Cottonseed at over 100 omega-6s to 1 omega-3, with rice bran and sesame oil nearly 140 to 1, and safflower oil at 150 to 1 ratio. These are incredibly oxidizing and inflammatory components in the cells and our metabolic systems. Let's look at the historical dietary fats versus today's seed oils. Fat is the preferred fuel of the human metabolism, and it has been since the dawn of mankind. Our bodies utilize fat in every cell, and fat makes up the vast majority of our brain, our neurological systems, and their functions. Fat plays a key role in energy production, cell signaling, hormone, cholesterol activity, and even shaping our gut microflora and our gut microbiome. Fats can enhance health and brain cognition by way of our gut-brain connection, or fats can diminish it. Fats, like minerals and vitamins, vary a lot in their structure, their function, and their purpose, and each play a crucial role in our genetic design and metabolic processes. It's the proper fats in the proper places, as well as the proper balance and ratios, that are key to optimum human health, energy, cognition, and anti-aging. Conversely, when too much of these fats, or even too little of these fats, occur in our diets, serious imbalances result in our cellular and metabolic process, and this brings about dysfunction and disease. Our focus is on the proper balance, types, and uses of these fats. Our metabolic and genetic design operates very specifically on the laws and principles of divine creation. This means that there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things. Health is really the evidence that we are working within that framework of our genetic and metabolic design. On the other hand, disease is evidence we are attempting to operate our genetic and metabolic systems in a way contrary to its divine origins. History shows that animal fats have sustained the human family for thousands upon thousands of years without causing disease. But to the contrary, within a few decades after incorporating seed oils into our diets, the expression of degenerative diseases really began to manifest itself. So this is where we've come from. An ancestral diet of real food and natural animal fats and very, very little sugar, to a highly processed, highly refined, high vegetable oil diet with a small amount of natural food. And this shift from natural foods and natural fats into processed food and seed oils is the reason that we are sick in every cell. We all have metabolically challenging dysfunction and disease. Now, let's look at our cattle. and what they eat, because this affects both the health of the livestock and the health of the consumer. They become what they eat. You go back and you look at these highly oxidative, inflammatory promoting diets of grains and seed oils being a major part of the livestock diet versus the forages, the grasses, the legumes, the natural forages that historically they ate, which are antioxidative, anti-inflammatory. When you compare the grain omega-6 to omega-3 ratios, you can see how closely reflected these omega-6, omega-3 ratios end up in the meat from whatever eats it, whether it's beef, chicken, pork, bison, lamb. It's very transparent to see how high the grains are versus what is reflected in the meat. So for example, GMO corn tends to stay to the mid-30s in the omega-6 to 3 ratio. They constantly almost always test at 33, 34, 35 to 1. Oats test at approximately 27 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Non-GMO corn is a little bit lower. It's in that 25 to 27 range. Wheat and barley stay close to that 15 to 1 ratio, where peas are a little bit under 10. When you look at an Angus Wagyu cross, you can tell it has been corn-fed, because that meat comes in at almost 27, 28 to 1. It has to be coming from corn. It can't come from wheat and barley. Chickens, poultry, typically fed some corn, wheat, and barley. And you can see it has a little bit lower ratio, but it's more in line with what wheat and barley are. Commercial pork, heavily corn-fed. There's no way wheat and barley can push nearly 30 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. This is corn-fed. Bison, corn-fed again. There's more corn in here than there is wheat and barley. And so you can see this direct correlation of the seed oil, inflammatory, oxidative omega-6s, and what's in the meat from the livestock that are fed these seed oils or grains. These are the actual tests from our pasture grasses at nearly 4.5 omega-3s to 1 omega-6. Our mixes of grasses and legumes at just over 2 omega-3s to 1 omega-6, and alfalfa the same. Here we want to compare the natural forages that nature or divine creation put in place. These forages are grasses, legumes, and they are antioxidative and they're anti-inflammatory. And so all of the type of grazing animals that eat this have a very low omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. In fact, it's low enough that it doesn't cause any health problems. So you look at bison that are grass-fed. We've tested many bison at approximately that 2 to 1 ratio. Mule deer that are eating natural forages are well under 2 to 1. Wild elk, just slightly over 2 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Pheasants, about 2.5 to 1 or slightly higher. Wild hare, tested right at the pheasant level, about 3 to 1. Red deer, roe deer on the European continent, 2.5 to 1. There are no excessive oxidation inflammatory issues. Antelope on the U.S. continent, 2.5 to 1. Moose was just barely over 2. And grass-fed beef is typically 1.5 to 2. God, through divine creation and natural law, created forages and foods that did not generate disease. Not only were the livestock or animals that ate it healthy, those animals that mankind consumed were healthy for the population consuming it. Nature made it this way, and never did it create disease or health problems. As we have taken a closer look at these animal forages and diets, we've realized the need to analyze more closely where the omega-6 and omega-3 balance is in the plants and where the excessive seed oil accumulation is. So looking at corn, what is the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of corn? So we took a plant and we separated the ear from the corn stalk. We sent the corn stalk in and we separated the kernels from the ear and sent those in to Microbac Laboratories in Pennsylvania. Interestingly enough, the corn plant came back with more omega-3s than omega-6s, 2 omega-3s to 1 omega-6. However, it's the kernel of the corn that came back at almost 34 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. This is exactly right in line with the other research on our corn that we've tested, anywhere from 25 to 35 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. By 2020, over 90% of the corn grown in the United States was genetically modified, while the corn stalk without the ear and kernels are actually in a safe range to use as far as the omega-6 to the omega-3 balance. The problem is genetically engineered corn is loaded with toxins. It has altered proteins, altered carbohydrates, and altered fats and oils, and it also is accompanied with a load of glyphosate. And we do not want this type of toxicity in our program. You have conventional and organic corn that could be used without the ear or kernels, but it will not convert well into usable nutrients because the corn plant is less digestible. It is a tremendous amount of high, long-chain carbohydrates of hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin, which are primarily almost all non-digestible. This is a steak from a national grocery store chain. And what has happened is we have shifted from grass-fed to feedlot type beef. And these are loaded with inflammatory oils. So conventionally raised feedlot beef is unhealthy because of their diet. These highly oxidative, highly inflammatory seed oils. Again, 97% of the meat we find in our grocery stores comes from feedlot operations. This particular steak is nearly 11 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. In looking at this typical piece of meat that we would find in a grocery store or supermarket, this is the incredibly good research of Dr. Chris Kenobi. And he talks about the omega-6 linoleic acid as it goes through the peroxidation process in our beef, or really any meat, and how it produces these dangerous toxins. So you go through this peroxidation process, or this lipid hydroperoxidation, and as these omega-6s break down, they form these cellular toxins, 4-hydroxynonenal, malondialdehyde. You have a whole series of oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. You have acrolein. You have carboxyethylpyrrole. And these compounds are cellular toxins. They are absolutely cytotoxic, genotoxic. They're mutagenic, they're carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, obesogenic, and teratogenic. Once these toxins are inside of us, they will cause cellular mutations, damage to our genetic information, held within our DNA. They cause cancer, birth defects, and these are the reason for the fatty plaque formations in our arteries. They generate blood clots, they cause obesity, and they are toxic to each of our cells. What as consumers we don't realize is this process doesn't just occur in us, it is occurring in the livestock before we consume it. This same peroxidization process causes a cascade of cellular poisons within these animals. So it isn't just the inflammatory oxidative omega-6s. As they break down through digestion and metabolism, they create cellular toxins. And so when we consume these types of meats from our livestock industry, our cattle, our poultry, our hogs, etc., we're not only consuming oxidative and inflammatory compounds, we're ingesting a host of cellular poisons that cause all kinds of cellular metabolic disease response. Dr. Kenobi has done an amazing amount of work in putting together this cascade of lipid peroxidization consequences. And as you go through this and you look at the processes and the mitochondrial dysfunction of energy dysregulation and failure, and then you look at the byproducts. So you have the hydroxynonenal, the malondialdehyde, the oxidated linoleic acid metabolites, carboxyethylpyrrole, and acrolein. And these all contribute to the disease of civilization. But you also have heart failure. You have obesity. You have multiple cancers. You have age-related macular degeneration, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, dementia. Then you have your metabolic syndrome, your type 2 diabetes, and your non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Again, all of these cellular poisons have a very distinct and direct effect on cellular health. So you look at the mutagenicity. It's the capacity to induce mutations in the cell. Genotoxicity. This is damage to our genetic information within the cell. Carcinogenesis is obviously cancer formation. Teratogenicidity is the cause in birth defects in fetuses. We have cytotoxicity, it becomes toxic to our cells. Atherogenic, this is the formation of plaque in our arteries. Thrombogenic, it generates blood clotting or other thrombosis. So it's destroying our blood cells. Obesogenic, obviously it's creating our obesity in our society. Not only does this catastrophic lipid cascade begin in the production of our livestock, but it continues in us. Having a diet high in grains and seed oils causes this breakdown of omega-6 linoleic acid into these cellular poisons. And these create these cellular dysfunction that result in those diseases that we're dealing with in our society today. So not only are our animals unhealthy, but we continue the cycle. We're consuming the cause and effect of the seed oils. We not only are eating unhealthy animals and very highly toxic byproducts, but then the problem begins to repeat in us. Unfortunately, meat is marketed on identity label, not on anything of quality or nutritional status. And so consumers have no idea what they're even buying or purchasing to consume. Identity labels are things like grain-fed versus grass-fed, natural versus organic, feedlot or pasture, Angus or Wagyu, beef, bison, prime or choice. Again, no drugs, no vaccines, antibiotic hormones. These are all labels, and they don't really disclose much about what the content of the meat is. What ultimately makes the greatest difference in any of these meats is simply the diet it was fed. Anything any type of meat, animal or livestock, that you are feeding a high grain, oilseed based diet is going to have very high elevated omega-6s in relation to its omega-3s. For example, prime pork from a national grocery store, 28.7 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. This pork was raised mostly on a grain-based diet of corn. You have beef from several different internet sites of 26.5 to 1 and 20.5 to 1. Again, these are predominantly corn-fed animals. Next, you have a type of beef that was grass-fed but corn-finished. It has a elevated omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 7.4 to 1. And then store-bought lamb. This is New Zealand lamb, and it's grass-fed and grain-finished. Organic chicken at 11.8 to 1. This number would reflect some corn and mostly grain of wheat and barley that's in the 15 to 1 range. And so as you look at this, people think, well, I'm eating organic, therefore I'm eating healthy. Well, it may lack the antibiotics and the chemicals and drugs from the conventional feedlot systems, but certainly the oxidizing omega-6 essential fatty acids that cause cellular dysfunction and dysregulation, yet further turn into cellular poisons, that's all still there. That makes this meat unhealthy and metabolically destructive. Generic chicken at 16 to 1. Again, you still have highly elevated omega-6 to omega-3 ratios, which are going to damage your cells. Generic eggs, 14.5 to 1. This can only come from grain-based diets. Bison at 21 to 1. These are grain-based diets with corn and wheat and barley to get the numbers this high. You'll often hear the argument from the bison people that bison is healthier than beef. Well, the reality is I can show you bison-fed grain at 21 to 1 ratio, and I can show you beef-fed grain at 20.5 to 1 ratio. They're the same thing. The breed and the variety doesn't make the difference. It's the feed that makes the difference. Look at bison that was fed grain mixed with hay. It has a much lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 3.6 to 1. Again, it isn't the animal, it's the diet. Look at the grass-fed. Grass-fed has a very healthy omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. It's under 2.5 to 1. It's non-inflammatory. And people buy grass-fed meat for its health properties. However, the drawbacks on grass-fed meat are it is tough. It takes 2.5 to 3 years to produce these animals, so there's more connective tissue. And because they are very lean, they have less flavor. There's less fat in the meat. Let's look at beef, bison, and lamb raised with the fermented forages as their diet. All of these ratios turn out so close to 1 to 1, which is the optimum ratio of omega-6s to omega-3 for the human genetic and metabolic system. Because of the fermentation process, we have a much faster growth rate than grass-fed and even feedlot grain-fed animals. We can produce a finished animal in less time than the other options. Because of that, they are young and they are very tender. But as important in the fermented forage, that fermentation, that predigestion, releases the energy within these grass forages to a much higher level. And so we have an excess of energy that is adequate to supply the metabolic system. It's adequate to supply the growth and maintenance and repair systems of the animal, and it supplies extra energy for fat accumulation. And so very often, our meat will grade choice and prime on grass-fed fermented forage diets. By using the fermented forage approach, we can produce the same animals in less time, saving feed costs. We can produce the highest quality of meat with extreme tenderness and at the healthiest omega-6 to omega-3 ratios for the human metabolic system. These next several slides give more detail on the origins of the meat and the testing. And so you can peruse through those at your leisure. We're going to move forward into more of the details about omega balanced natural meats. The benefit of using our fermented forage program is that we can produce a healthier, more premium meat in much less time. Grass-fed beef can take 2.5 to 3 years to reach slaughter weight, and it's going to be tough and lean. Feedlot beef can take 24 months or more. Our beef and bison take approximately 15 months to raise. Lambs in our part of the country are typically born in January and February, and they reach approximately 100 pounds in September. Our lambs are born in May, and they are at 90 to 100 pounds in September. And so we have this accelerated growth, this accelerated quality on much less feed in much less time. We tested the Snake River Farms ribeye steak at 26.5 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. To get meat this high and elevated in omega-6s, it has to come from corn. Corn ranges from 25 to 35 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. However, the omega-balanced natural beef fed on fermented forages, grasses, and some legumes will come in at a very balanced, nearly 1-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. In our 2021 test, we actually had lower omega-6s at 0.83 to our 1 omega-3. Here we have two types of pork fed different diets. We have commercial pork, and we have pork from a McCafferty Ranch feeding operation. We use these two products to illustrate how the diet is reflected within the meat essential fatty acid ratios of omega-6 to omega-3. The commercial pork tested at 28.7 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Now, corn runs between 25 and 35 omega-6s to 1 omega-3, so you can clearly see that the corn diet would reflect in the meat of this commercial pork at nearly 29-to-1. However, on the McCafferty pork, it has an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 8.21-to-1. Now, this is lower, but the source of its feed is 3-day-old barley fodder and 3-day-old peas. And the barley fodder measures 12.27 omega-6s to 1 omega-3 and 7.4 omega-6s to 1 omega-3 on the 3-day-old peas. With this diet, you can see that the pork reflected in the McCafferty test is right between the two fodder feeds of barley and peas. And this would be reflective of its diet. In comparing beef products, you have Riverbend Ranch, grass-fed finished beef, and McCafferty Ranch, grass-fed fodder finished. And so these are three different diets, but let's observe and see what the end product of the meat reflects from the diets each of these animals received. The Riverbend Ranch is grass-fed, but it is corn finished. And so instead of being down close to 1 or 2 omega-6s to 1, 3, it's elevated to 7.4 omega-6s to 1 omega-3 because of the corn in the last several months of its life. Now, grass-fed and grass-finished beef is close to that 1 to 1.5 or 2 to 1 ratio, omega-6 to omega-3. You look at the grasses from the pasture, they actually contain more omega-3s than they do omega-6s. We tested grasses in pastures at 4.44 omega-3s to just 1 omega-6. When you look at the McCafferty Ranch, these are grass-fed but fodder finished. This diet reflects the meat at 4.78 omega-6s to 1. Now, again, a grass-fed diet will give it a very low 1.5 to 2 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. However, for the last several months of the animal's life, it is fed barley and pea fodder that is 3 days old, and the barley fodder at over 12 to 1 and the pea fodder at over 7 to 1 has elevated what would normally be a very close omega-6 to omega-3 ratio to meat that's almost 5 to 1. These are the results of Omega Balanced Natural Beef in 2021. We took one of our T-bone steaks and we compared it to grass-fed and Wagyu that we purchased again in large regional grocery stores. Our Omega Balance Natural Beef came in at 0.83 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. The grass-fed, which was honestly grass-fed, 1.34 to 1. So you know it's grass-fed, grass-finished all the way through. Wagyu came in at 6.63 to 1. So you know it was finished with grain in its diet. These are pictures of the actual New York steak that we took that sold at a cost of $24.99 a pound, and the prime Wagyu ribeye that sold for $34.99 a pound. Again, cost is not an indicator of quality or health. Typically, your grain-fed animals are going to be accompanied with hormones, vaccines, antibiotics, and the toxins from the genetically engineered crops. Now, because they're feeding them grains, they're typically going to grade select or choice, and some will actually grade prime. But again, the appearance of the meat doesn't give you the true content of what's in it. So we've gone back historically, 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, again in 23. We'll have tests again in 24. But you can see that we maintain a very, very close ratio on all of our beef or bison or lamb at very close to 1 to 1 or even under. Now, in 2023, we did an interesting test. We allowed our forages to actually go into more of a mature or reproduction state. And what we found, as the plant matures, the level of omega-6s began to increase in the plant in preparation of putting them back into a grain. Now remember, from a previous slide, we had shown that wheat and barley in the seed form were in that 15 omega-6 to 1 omega-3 ratio. And so this plant is preparing to go into reproduction and push those omega-6s back into the seed as it finishes. So what we learned from this trial and this test was that we can actually increase our omega-6 to omega-3 ratios in our meat if we harvest our forages even a little bit too late, which is really a good test to know. So there is a prime time in when to cut and harvest our forages, and it's right at that point in the vegetation stage. As it goes into reproduction, it has all of its vegetative growth, but it hasn't started to produce the higher omega-6s in the plant yet. Here's an example of the Biominerals Technology lambs versus New Zealand lamb. Again, ours are grown on fermented forages from birth to finish. We have a very close 1-to-1 ratio on our lamb, while the New Zealand lamb, which is grass-fed and grain-finished, has an elevated over 7 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. You look at poultry, both meat and eggs. We can produce omega-balanced eggs at almost 1-to-1 ratio. Now you go into a store and buy generally commercial eggs, and these are ranging anywhere from 14 omega-6s or higher to 1 omega-3. Now here are organic eggs from various organic operations in different states. You have 8-to-1 ratio, again because it's grain and soybean oil based. You have another non-organic but grain-fed feeding operation at a little over 8-to-1 ratio. Now, feed store for chicken mix, when you go into a farm store or a cooperative store and you're buying typical feed mix for your chickens, you can end up with anywhere from a 10 to a 20-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, depending on the ingredients of grain. Anything with higher corn is going to throw those omega-6s much higher. Now, there are commercial operations that will balance out their rations with more flax. Flaxseed is 5 omega-3s to 1 omega-6, and so they can produce a high omega-3 egg, which is actually a little bit closer in balance than the commercial feeds. And we tested those at nearly 2 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. But again, they're using flax to offset the grain in their feeding process. But it works. Again, organic chicken versus generic chicken, you still have those elevated omega-6s versus the 3s because of the diet. In an overall comparison of what we find in nature with natural forages and wildlife or livestock, compared to grain diets high in seed oils versus the omega balanced natural meat fermented forage programs, you can look and see where these healthy, unhealthy, and highly unhealthy degenerative disease promoting ratios of omega-6 to omega-3 are. All animals on natural grazed forages have a very healthy omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. There are no animals in confined feeding operations that are fed grains that have healthy omega-6 to 3 ratios. Instead, they're highly disease-promoting, highly oxidative. The fermented forage program, Omega Balanced Natural Meats, has the most consistent and low omega-6 to omega-3 ratios of any meats we have tested. They are consistently in that 1-to-1, 2-to-1 range. And this covers everything that we feed, from beef to bison to lamb to poultry. It is the diets that these very same animals eat that makes all the difference in the health or the disease promoting properties within the meat, the milk, or the eggs. The natural diets of humans has been replaced by nutrient deficient, highly processed and unnatural foods with excessive seed oils. Livestock production has shifted away from natural grazing of grasses and herbs into confined animal feeding operations known as CAFOs, using primarily grain for foods. Grains high in omega-6 cause excessive oxidative damage within our cells and our metabolic systems. This results in chronic inflammation and further degrades into cellular poisons. Grains are oxidative, while grasses and legumes are antioxidative. Corn, the plant versus the grain, are very different. While the plant maintains a very close omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, the grain has an excessively elevated omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, anywhere from 25 to 35 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Feedlot beef is unhealthy due to the grain diets containing excessive linoleic acid or omega-6, and this causes the lipid hydroperoxides. These are the cellular poisons that come as these oxidizing omega-6s break down. And we consume these when we eat that meat. Meat is marketed on identity labels, such as what the breed type is or what the feed type is. And this approach does nothing to disclose the real content or nutrition of what's in the meat. Omega-balanced natural meats and eggs are superior to grass-fed and especially grain-fed meats in quality and in promoting health, not only for the animals, but also for the consumers.